The trading station floated in the darkness of space between two distant star systems, where ships came and went every hour, bringing travelers from hundreds of different worlds and species across the galaxy to buy and sell and trade their goods. In the massive halls and corridors that stretched for miles inside the metal structure that humans called Meridian Point, but which had other names in other languages, spoken by creatures with scales and crystals and forms that defied easy description. One corner of the main communal eating area sat a small human boy who looked to be about 7 years old by Earth standards, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that were a deep brown color that seemed sad and tired as he sat, alone at a table made for much larger beings with his legs dangling far above the floor, because the chair was built for a species that stood nearly 8 feet tall on average. His name was Leo, and he had been waiting for 3 days now. Around him, the station bustled with activity as merchants called out prices in a dozen different languages, and translators worked overtime to convert the sounds into something resembling communication, while servers carried trays of food that ranged from simple proteins to living creatures that some species considered delicacies, though the sight of them made Leo feel sick to his stomach when he accidentally looked too closely at what was writhing on those plates. Nobody paid attention to the small, human child sitting alone in his corner, except to occasionally throw mocking glances his way, or make comments loud enough for him to hear about how pathetic humans were, compared to the other species that had reached the stars long before Earth, had even developed basic spaceflight capabilities. A massive creature covered in thick armor plates and sporting 4 powerful arms, stopped near the table where Leo sat and looked down at him with multiple eyes that gleamed with something like amusement mixed with contempt as it spoke in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. The creature said that humans were the weakest species in the entire known galaxy, with no natural weapons like claws or fangs, and no venom or armor or any of the advantages that evolution had given to the truly strong races who had earned their place among the stars through millions of years of survival of the fittest, while humans had barely crawled out of their caves a few thousand years ago. Beings nearby laughed at this assessment and added their own observations about human frailty, including one serpent-like traitor, who slithered closer and asked Leo where his mother had gone, and whether she had finally realized that keeping a human child alive was too expensive and too much trouble when resources were scarce, and every credit counted towards survival in the cold mathematics of space travel. Leo kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, where a half-eaten meal of synthetic protein sat cooling and congealing into something even less appetizing than it had been when first served to him hours earlier. But he had learned over the past 3 days that responding to the taunts only made them worse, and that staying quiet and small and unnoticeable was the best strategy for avoiding actual physical harm. His mother had told him to wait for her at the station, and that she would return within 2 days at most because she had important business to handle, but she had promised that she would never abandon him no matter what happened or how dangerous things became out there. In the vast emptiness between worlds, where pirates and military forces and corporate raiders all competed for territory and resources. 3 days had passed since she left. The station master appeared near the table where Leo sat, looking like a blob of translucent gel that somehow maintained a roughly spherical shape despite having no visible skeleton or structure inside its body mass. And when it spoke, the words seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep within that gelatinous form, creating sounds that the translator converted into standard galactic common. The station master, whose name was something unpronounceable, that the translator rendered as prefix, told Leo that his time was up, and that if payment was not received by the next morning cycle, then the boy would be sold to one of the labor contractors who regularly visited the station, looking for cheap workers who could be exploited in the mines and factories that dotted the frontier worlds where safety regulations were minimal, and life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. Leo wanted to say that his mother would return soon, but his voice seemed to have stopped working properly, and all he could manage was a small nod that prefix interpreted as understanding, before the blob oozed away to attend to other matters, leaving Leo alone again with his thoughts and his growing fear as the station lights dimmed to simulate night for those species that required regular sleep cycles. Leo remained sitting at his table because he had nowhere else to go, and the storage unit where he and his mother had been staying had been locked after they missed the second payment, and their belongings had been seized pending settlement of the outstanding debt. Through the viewport next to his table, Leo could see stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds thrown carelessly onto black velvet, and he wondered which of those distant points of light might be the sun that warmed Earth where his father had been born, before dying in some conflict that Leo barely remembered, except for vague impressions of a tall man with kind eyes who used to lift him high above his head and make whooshing sounds like a spaceship taking off. His mother never talked much about his father, except to say that he had been brave and good, and that he had loved Leo very much before the universe had taken him away in the cruel and random fashion that characterized life among the stars, where death could come from equipment failure or pirate attack or simple bad luck with equal probability. Leo curled up on the bench seat, trying to make himself as small as possible, while around him the station continued its endless cycle of commerce and conversation, and the casual cruelty that beings showed to those they perceived as weaker or less valuable than themselves. What none of them knew, as they laughed and mocked and went about their business, was that the woman they had dismissed as just another desperate human, trying to survive in a galaxy that had no use for her kind, was actually something else entirely. Something ancient and powerful and terrifying. Something that had given up a throne and an empire to live quietly among the younger races and raise her half-human son in peace, away from the politics and violence that had characterized her former life. Something that was about to remind every being in this sector of space why her people had once been feared above all others. But for now, Leo simply waited in his corner watching the stars and believing with the simple faith of a child that his mother would return, because she had promised, and his mother never broke her promises no matter what. The temperature in the station dropped slightly as the environmental systems adjusted for night cycle, and Leo shivered in his thin clothing. But he did not move from his spot, because this corner had become familiar and safe in a relative sense, and moving meant potentially drawing attention from beings who might decide that a small human child could be useful or valuable or simply entertaining to torment. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. But tonight, Leo would wait and hope and trust that somewhere out there among the infinite stars his mother was coming back to him. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the song she used to sing in a language he did not fully understand, with words that sounded like wind chimes and flowing water mixed together into something beautiful and sad and older than human civilization. The song of the Etherians. Commander Vex stood on the bridge of his warship, studying the holographic display that showed a small vessel drifting through the sector of space that his fleet controlled with absolute authority, because the Cravaxian Empire did not tolerate unauthorized travel through their territory, and this particular ship had ignored 3 separate warnings to change course and submit to inspection. The ship was human in design, which made Vex click his mandibles together in amusement, because humans were known across the galaxy as one of the weakest species with minimal military capability and technology that was centuries behind the more advanced civilizations that had been traveling between stars since before Earth had even developed written language. Vex commanded a fleet of 12 warships, each one capable of destroying entire cities from orbit, and crewed by soldiers who had trained their entire lives for combat in the brutal tradition of the Cravaxian military, where only the strongest survived, and weakness was eliminated before it could spread through the ranks. This single human vessel represented no threat whatsoever. Vex opened a communication channel and transmitted his standard message, informing the ship that it was surrounded, and that resistance would result in immediate destruction, and that the crew should power down all systems and prepare to be boarded, so that cargo and identification could be verified according to Imperial law. The response came after a few seconds of silence, and it was a voice that sounded female and human and utterly calm in a way that suggested either stupidity or confidence that was completely misplaced given the tactical situation. The voice identified the ship as the Star Dancer and demanded that the Cravaxian fleet stand down and allow immediate passage, because the speaker had urgent business elsewhere and no time for delays caused by petty territorial disputes between species who should know better than to interfere with her travel. Vex felt his forearms tense with anger at the disrespect being shown to the Cravaxian Empire by this insignificant human who clearly did not understand the danger she faced, but he maintained professional composure and informed her that she had one final opportunity to surrender before his ships opened fire. The woman interrupted him before he could finish his threat, and spoke a name that made every officer on the bridge freeze in sudden fear. She said her name was Elena Shadowmere. That name existed only in the oldest records and in stories that were told to young soldiers as cautionary tales about the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of knowing when to retreat, because the Shadowmere bloodline had once ruled an empire that spanned thousands of systems and commanded power that made modern weapons look like primitive tools. The Etherians had vanished 5,000 years ago after destroying their own civilization in some kind of civil war or religious transformation that the historical records did not explain clearly, because most of the documentation had been deliberately erased or lost in the chaos that followed their disappearance from galactic affairs. Everyone knew that the Etherians were extinct, Vex told himself that this was clearly some kind of trick or scam, designed to scare away his fleet so that the human ship could escape with whatever contraband it was carrying in its cargo holds. But even as he spoke these words of reassurance to his crew, he felt doubt creeping into his mind. The woman suggested that if Vex did not believe her claim, then he should send his boarding party and find out for himself whether she was lying, and her tone carried a note of amusement that made his skin crawl. Beneath his armor, pride overcame caution, and Vex ordered 30 of his best soldiers to teleport aboard the human vessel and secure it by force while killing anyone who resisted, because the Cravaxian Empire did not negotiate with those who showed disrespect. The boarding party materialized inside the corridor of the Star Dancer, and Vex watched through their helmet cameras as they moved forward with weapons ready and scanning systems active, looking for any sign of hidden defenses or crew members preparing an ambush. The interior of the ship was simple and clean with minimal decoration, and no obvious weapons or security systems that might pose a threat to trained Cravaxian warriors who had each survived hundreds of combat engagements. Single figure stood in the main corridor with her back turned toward the boarding party. She was tall for a human female, standing perhaps 6 feet in height, with silver hair that fell down her back in waves that seemed to catch and reflect light, in ways that normal hair should not. And when she turned to face the soldiers, Vex felt his breath catch in his throat, despite watching only through a camera feed. Her skin was pale like moonlight, and her eyes glowed with an inner purple fire that was clearly not human, and could not be produced by any cybernetic enhancement that Vex had ever seen in his decades of military service, and her ears swept back in elegant points that marked her as something other than human. Despite the ship she traveled in, she was beautiful in a way that seemed almost dangerous, as though looking at her for too long might cause permanent damage to the mind. But what stood beside her made the entire boarding party step backward in instinctive fear. The dragon was massive, even though it had somehow compressed itself to fit inside the corridor of a ship that should not have been able to contain anything larger than a human-sized being, and its scales shimmered with colors that shifted between midnight, blue and deep purple depending on how the light struck them. Its eyes burned with the same inner fire as the woman, and when it opened its mouth to reveal rows of crystalline teeth, each one longer than a Cravaxian forearm, a low growl emerged that resonated through the hull and made the entire ship vibrate with a frequency that bypassed armor and went straight into the bones of every soldier present. The woman spoke in a voice that was soft but carried absolute authority as she introduced her companion as Ember, and explained that he did not appreciate threats directed at her, or worse still, any harm that had come to her son. While she had been away, Vex screamed orders through the communication channel, telling his soldiers to open fire and eliminate both targets before they could act. But even as the words left his mandibles, he knew it was already too late. Plasma bolts filled the corridor, creating a light show that the helmet cameras captured in perfect detail as 30 elite Cravaxian warriors unleashed enough firepower to vaporize a small building. But the bolts simply splashed harmlessly against scales that had been forged in the hearts of dying stars, according to the old legends. The dragon moved with speed. That should have been impossible for something its size, flowing through the corridor like water, and the screams that came through the communication channel made several bridge officers collapse, clutching their heads, as psychic feedback from the dying soldiers transmitted their final moments of terror directly into the minds of anyone connected to the network. One by one, the helmet cameras went dark. When the feeds returned, seconds later, the corridor was empty except for scorched pieces of armor and weapons that had been melted into slag by heat beyond what any modern technology could produce. Alina Shadowmere stood at the airlock controls with her hand resting casually on the panel while Ember coiled protectively around her massive form, somehow fitting into a space that geometry said should not accommodate him. She looked directly at the camera that Vex was watching through and spoke in a voice that promised terrible consequences. She said that Vex should inform his empire that the Etherian queen had returned from exile, and that she wanted her son back unharmed, and that anyone who had touched him or threatened him or made him feel afraid would answer to her personally in ways that would make death seem like a mercy. She triggered the airlock and spaced the remaining equipment, sending it tumbling into the void, while the Star Dancer powered up weapons that should not have existed on a civilian vessel, but which the sensors clearly identified as royal class. Armaments from the old empire capable of destroying entire fleets with single shots. The Kravaxian warships scattered in every direction, abandoning formation and pride and military discipline in favor of simple survival instinct as they engaged faster than light drives and fled the sector as quickly as their engines could manage. Vex remained on the bridge of his flagship, watching the sensor displays as the Star Dancer accelerated toward Meridian Point on a direct course that would take it straight through contested space that no single ship should dare to cross. Behind the small vessel, the sensors detected something else. More dragons, dozens of them emerging from wherever they had been hiding for the past 5,000 years and forming up into a fleet that moved with perfect coordination as they followed their queen toward a reunion that the galaxy would remember for generations to come. Commander Vex sat down heavily in his command chair and began composing the report that would inform the Kravaxian High Command that their understanding of galactic power structures had just become completely obsolete. News traveled faster than light when it was carried by quantum communication networks that connected every major station and planet across the civilized galaxy. And within hours of Commander Vex sending his panicked report, every government and corporation and criminal organization knew that an Etherian had emerged from hiding after 5,000 years of silence. More than just any Etherian, but a queen who commanded the ancient royal bloodline and traveled with dragons that were supposed to be extinct and possessed weapons that could destroy modern warships as easily as a child might crush an insect. The implications were staggering because if one Etherian had survived, then perhaps others had also been living in disguise among the younger races, and if the dragons had returned, then the old power structures that everyone had assumed were gone forever might suddenly reassert themselves across the galaxy. Meridian Point went into immediate lockdown as Station Master Prefix tried desperately to figure out how to handle the situation, because the human child sitting in the corner of the communal hall was suddenly the most valuable and dangerous individual on the entire station. Military vessels began arriving in the OWL system within hours, coming from a dozen different governments who all wanted to either protect the child as a bargaining chip or capture him as a hostage to use against his mother. When she inevitably came looking for him, corporate security forces arrived next, hoping to secure rights to any Etherian technology that might be recovered, and criminal syndicates sent their best operatives because kidnapping the son of an ancient queen seemed like the kind of opportunity that only came once in a lifetime. Leo had been moved from the communal hall to a secure holding area that Prefix described as being for the boy's own protection. Though the armed guards stationed outside the door and the energy barriers sealing the room suggested that protection was not the primary concern. Leo sat on a metal bench in the small windowless room, swinging his legs and humming the song his mother used to sing in the old language that predated human civilization and most of the other languages currently spoken across the galaxy. One of the guards was a human male, who looked to be in his 50s with scars across his face that suggested a long career in combat situations. And unlike the other guards who treated Leo like a piece of valuable cargo, this man seemed uncomfortable with the entire situation. His name was Captain Hayes, and he had been hired by Prefix to provide additional security during the lockdown, because his reputation as a reliable mercenary made him valuable when things got complicated. Hayes watched Leo humming peacefully and shook his head in confusion at how calm the child seemed, given that he was effectively a prisoner, surrounded by people who wanted to use him as leverage against a being of incredible power. Hayes asked Leo if he understood what was happening outside, and whether he was afraid of what might come next. Leo stopped humming and looked up at the guard with eyes that seemed too knowing for a 7-year-old child, and said simply that his mother was coming to get him because she always came when he needed her. Hayes told Leo that he should understand the reality of the situation, because his mother had just declared war on half the galaxy by attacking a Kravaxian fleet, and now every military, force and bounty hunter and criminal organization was either hunting for her or waiting to ambush her when she arrived at Meridian Point. The captain said that if Elena was smart, she would cut her losses and disappear back into hiding, rather than walking into an obvious trap. Leo smiled in a way that suggested he knew something that Hayes did not, and said that the captain did not know his mother very well if he thought she would abandon her son, no matter what forces stood against her. The lights flickered. Then they went completely dark, except for the emergency lighting that cast everything in red and made shadows dance across the walls as alarms began blaring throughout the station. Hayes moved to the viewport set into the wall of the holding area and looked out at the space surrounding Meridian Point, where dozens of military vessels had taken up defensive positions around the station, creating overlapping fields of fire that should have been able to stop any single ship from approaching. The ships were not firing at each other despite representing at least 8 different governments and factions who normally would have engaged in combat the moment they came within weapons range. They were all firing at something else, something that moved between them like a living shadow flowing through space with grace that no mechanical vessel should possess. The Star Dancer had arrived, but it was not alone. Accompanying the small ship were creatures that existed only in myths and legends and ancient historical records that most modern species dismissed as exaggerations or fabrications. Dragons, dozens of them ranging in size from fighters no larger than atmospheric craft to massive dreadnought-class beings whose wingspans measured in kilometers and whose bodies seemed to be made of living crystal and metal, and something else that defied easy classification. They moved in perfect formation with the Star Dancer at the center of a protective formation that shifted and flowed like a school of fish responding to threats. Before those threats even fully materialized, weapons fire from the assembled military vessels splashed harmlessly against scales that reflected energy and kinetic rounds with equal ease, while the dragons did not bother returning fire because they did not need to. They simply moved through the defensive perimeter as though it did not exist, crushing ships that did not move aside quickly enough with casual swipes of claws or tails that crumpled advanced armor plating like paper. Hayes watched in stunned silence as the greatest concentration of military power he had ever seen in one place was scattered like leaves in a storm by beings that should not exist. Leo stood up on his bench to get a better view through the viewport and said calmly that his mother had brought friends. The door to the holding area exploded inward with a blast of force that sent the guards flying backward and left Hayes barely standing, as he grabbed onto a support beam to keep from being knocked unconscious. Elena Shadowmere stood in the destroyed doorway wearing armor that seemed to be made of starlight itself, flowing and solid at the same time, shifting between forms that the eye could not quite track or understand. A crown of crystal and silver sat upon her head, catching the emergency lighting and transforming it into rainbow patterns that danced across the walls. In her hand, she carried a blade that hummed with power, generating a sound that resonated in the bones of everyone present and made the metal walls of the station vibrate in harmony. Behind her, Ember filled the corridors, somehow compressing his massive form to fit through spaces that should have been far too small while maintaining the sense of coiled power ready to be unleashed at any moment. Leo ran forward without hesitation, and Elena caught him in her arms, lifting him up and holding him close while speaking softly in the old language that sounded like music and wind chimes mixed together. Hayes stood frozen watching this reunion between mother and child, while processing the fact that he was standing in the presence of a being who had just torn through the combined military might of 8 different governments like they were nothing more than annoying obstacles. Elena looked up from her son, and her eyes fixed on Hayes with an intensity that made him want to run, despite his decades of combat experience. She asked in a voice that could freeze stars who had struck her son. Hayes looked at Leo and saw the fading bruise on the boy's cheek that he had noticed earlier, and realized with growing horror that Elena could somehow see or sense that injury despite only just arriving. The captain said quickly that it had been an accident during transport, and that he had tried to protect the boy, but that some of the other guards had been rougher than necessary. Elena's expression went cold in a way that suggested death was not just possible but inevitable for someone. She said that Hayes was telling the truth about trying to protect Leo, and that she could smell the lack of guilt on him, but that someone else in this station had harmed her. Child Ember's growl shook the walls of the holding area, causing cracks to appear in the metal, and making several support beams groan under stress. They were not designed to handle. One of the other guards, who had been knocked down by the exploding door, scrambled backward in terror. As Elena's gaze swept across the fallen soldiers, the guard was a young Kravaxian who had been part of the team that had transported Leo from the communal hall to the holding area, and his fear was so intense that his armor was rattling from his. Shaking, Elena asked where Station Master Prefix could be found. The Kravaxian guard stammered that Prefix was in the main control center, trying to coordinate some kind of response to the Dragon fleet that was currently dismantling every ship that did not immediately retreat from the system. Elena handed Leo to Hayes and told the captain to keep her son safe for a few more minutes, while she went to have a conversation with the beings who had thought it acceptable to threaten a child. Hayes accepted the boy automatically and watched as Elena and Ember moved down the corridor toward the control center, with purpose that suggested nothing in the universe could stop them from reaching their destination. Leo looked up at Hayes and said, quietly, that the captain should probably come along because his mother would want to thank him properly for being kind when others were not. The main hall of Meridian Point had been transformed without anyone actually moving furniture or building anything new, because Elena simply stood at the center of the vast space, and reality itself seemed to bend around her, making it clear that this was now a throne room, even though no physical throne existed. Every being who had mocked Leo or threatened him or ignored his suffering over the past 3 days had been gathered by the dragons who had moved through the station with terrifying efficiency, rounding up specific individuals while leaving others untouched because somehow they knew exactly who had been cruel and who had shown even small amounts of kindness. Station Master Prefix was at the front of the assembly, his gelatinous form quivering with fear as he tried to make himself smaller, while simultaneously attempting to maintain some dignity in front of the hundreds of witnesses who had been brought to watch whatever judgment was about to be delivered. Behind Elena stood Ember in his full magnificent glory, no longer compressing himself to fit human-sized corridors, but instead filling the space with presence that made the air itself feel heavy with potential violence. Leo stood beside his mother, holding her hand and looking out at the crowd with the same calm expression he had worn while sitting alone in his corner, waiting for her return. Captain Hayes stood slightly to the side, having been positioned there by Elena with a gentle but firm instruction to remain close because she had plans for him. Prefix began speaking before Elena could say anything, attempting to take control of the situation through the sheer force of words and apologies. He said that they had not known Leo's heritage, and that surely Elena could understand that running a station required making difficult decisions about resources, and that if they had realized the child was the son of an Etherian queen, they would have treated him with all appropriate respect and honor. Elena let him finish his prepared speech before responding in a voice that carried to every corner of the massive hall. Without needing amplification, she said that Prefix had missed the point entirely. What she understood was that Prefix and the others had seen a child who was small and defenseless and alone, and rather than showing even basic compassion, they had chosen cruelty. They had threatened to sell him into slavery, not because they did not know his mother's identity, but because they thought he was powerless and beneath their concern. Elena began to pace slowly, her armor chiming softly with each step, while Ember watched the crowd with eyes that tracked every movement, every nervous gesture, every attempt to edge toward the exits that were now blocked by dragons who had positioned themselves with clear strategic purpose. She told them a story about the Etherian Empire as it had existed 5,000 years ago, when her ancestors had ruled half the known galaxy with technology that seemed like magic and power that allowed them to reshape planets and move stars. The Etherians had believed that their strength gave them the right to dominate other species and to take what they wanted and to treat lesser beings as resources, to be exploited rather than as individuals with their own value and dignity. They had built a civilization of incredible beauty and terrible cruelty. Elena stopped pacing and looked directly at the assembled beings with an expression that mixed sadness and anger in equal measure. She said that eventually the wisest among the Etherians had realized they had become monsters, and that all their technology and power meant nothing if they used it only to cause suffering. So they had made a choice that no other dominant species in galactic history had ever made. They destroyed their own empire from within. They freed every slave and disbanded every fleet and scattered across the galaxy, taking only what they could carry and living in disguise among the species they had once ruled. They did this because they believed that true strength was not about domination, but about knowing when to step back and let others grow without interference. Alina gestured to Leo, who looked up at her with trust that was absolute and unshakable. She said that she had given up her throne and her titles and everything that came with being Etherian royalty because she wanted to live a simple life. She had fallen in love with a human soldier who saw her not as a queen or as a member of an ancient race, but simply as a woman who needed kindness. They had a child together, and she had wanted Leo to grow up knowing humility and understanding what it felt like to be vulnerable, so that he would never make the mistakes his ancestors had made. But watching him sit alone and afraid in the corner of the communal hall while beings who should have known better mocked him and threatened him, had shown her that the galaxy had not learned the lessons that the Etherians had paid such a high price to teach. The crowd was silent now. Even Prefix had stopped his attempts to justify his actions. Elena's voice dropped lower, becoming something that resonated not just in the ears but in the chest and bones of everyone present. She said that she was going to make some changes. Meridian Point would no longer be a place where the strong preyed on the weak. It would be placed under neutral oversight with new management that actually understood the concept of protecting those who needed protection. Alina pointed at Captain Hayes, who looked startled to suddenly become the focus of attention. She said that Hayes would be the new station master because he had shown kindness to her son when others had not. Had recognized that being strong meant protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. Hayes started to protest that he was just a mercenary and not qualified to run an entire trading station. But Elena cut him off with a gesture. She said that compassion and basic decency were more important qualifications than any amount of administrative experience. As for Prefix and the others who had directly threatened Leo, they would not be killed or imprisoned or subjected to the kinds of punishments that the old Etherian Empire might have used. Instead, they would spend the next 10 years in community service helping the very people they had once exploited. They would work in shelters for refugees and schools for children from poor families and medical facilities that served those who could not afford proper care. They would do this under the watchful supervision of the dragon clans, who were even less forgiving than Elena herself, and who would ensure that every moment of service was genuine and meaningful. Several dragons moved forward, taking positions around Prefix and the other condemned beings, making it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. Elena knelt down beside Leo and pulled him close while addressing the crowd one final time. She said that her son was half-human, which meant he had all the weaknesses that beings across the galaxy loved to mock. He could be hurt and broken and killed just as easily as any other child. But he was also her son, which made him the heir to an empire that had once made entire civilizations tremble with fear. She said that true strength was not about what you could destroy, but about what you chose to protect. Leo would grow up knowing both sides of his heritage. He would be strong like the Etherians, but compassionate like the humans, and if the galaxy was very lucky, his generation would finally understand that power without wisdom was worthless, and that even the smallest life had value. Ember raised his massive head and released a roar that shook the entire station, causing viewport panels to crack and making the metal structure groan. And flecks outside in space, the assembled dragon fleet echoed the call, creating a sound that traveled through quantum channels and was heard on planets dozens of light years away. It was a declaration and a warning. The Etherians had returned, not as conquerors but as guardians. They would be watching over the vulnerable and the weak. They would be protecting those who could not protect themselves, and anyone who forgot that even the smallest child deserved safety and kindness would face consequences that made death seem merciful. Elena stood and took Leo's hand, leading him toward the exit, while the crowd parted before them like water captain. Hayes followed because he had apparently just been promoted to one of the most important positions in the sector and needed to figure out what that actually meant. Behind them, Prefix and the others were led away by dragons whose eyes promised that the next 10 years would be very educational. The station trembled again, But this time it was not from weapons or violence. It was from the weight of change settling into place. A new age had begun, whether the galaxy was ready for it or not. And at the center of it all was a small human boy who had survived mockery and cruelty, through simple faith that his mother would return. That faith had been rewarded, and the entire galaxy would remember the lesson. 3 months had passed since the day Elena Shadowmere arrived at Meridian Point with her dragon fleet, and changed everything about how the station operated, and how beings from across the galaxy thought about power and responsibility. The trading station still bustled with activity, but now there were new sections dedicated to education and medical care, and shelters for refugees who had nowhere else to go. Captain Hayes had proven to be an excellent station master, despite his initial protests, that he was unqualified because he treated everyone fairly and made decisions based on what would help the most vulnerable, rather than what would generate the most profit. Leo sat in a classroom that had been established in one of the converted cargo bays, surrounded by children from a dozen different species, all learning together under the protection of the reformed station. His desk was between a young Velith girl named Maya, who had scales that shimmered green and gold in the light, and a Kravaxian boy named Kai, whose father had been part of the fleet that tried to stop Elena from reaching the station. Maya leaned over while the teacher was writing equations on the display board and whispered, asking if it was really true that Leo's mother was an actual queen. Leo kept his eyes on his math problem and nodded while explaining that yes, his mother was a queen, but she always said that being a queen was not the important part. Kai asked what the important part was if being royalty did not matter. Leo thought about it for a moment, remembering conversations with his mother during quiet evenings when she would tuck him into bed and tell him stories about the old empire and why it had fallen. He said that his mother believed the important part was choosing to be kind even when you were strong enough not to be. The classroom door opened and Elena entered, dressed in simple human-style clothing, with her silver hair pulled back in a practical style and no crown or armor visible anywhere. But there was no mistaking the power in the way she moved or the ancient wisdom in her eyes that seemed to see everything. Leo jumped up from his desk and ran to her, calling out for his mom in the excited voice of a child who had not seen his parent for several hours. Elena caught him and lifted him off his feet in a hug that made him laugh. She asked how school had been, and Leo said it was good because they had learned about pre-contact civilizations, and the teacher had asked if he could bring some Etherian artifacts for show and tell next week. Elena laughed, and the sound was like music filling the classroom and making even the most nervous students smile. She said that bringing ancient artifacts to school might be arranged if the teacher was willing to take responsibility for items that were older than most current civilizations. She looked around at the other children who were watching with expressions that ranged from awe to curiosity to the kind of casual acceptance that children often had for things that adults found remarkable. Elena greeted them warmly and said that Leo had told her wonderful things about all his new friends. Maya gathered her courage and asked if it was true that Elena had a dragon. Elena corrected her gently, saying that she did not have a dragon because Ember was his own being with his own thoughts and choices, and that he was her companion and friend rather than her possession. Then she asked if the children would like to meet him. The classroom erupted in excited agreement that made the teacher smile and shake her head in amused resignation. Later that afternoon, on one of the observation decks that had been converted into a recreational area, Ember lay in his magnificent glory, allowing children to climb over his wings and ask endless questions about what it was like to fly through space and whether dragons really could breathe fire and how old he was. Ember bore it all with patient grace, occasionally rumbling responses in the ancient language that Elena translated into standard galactic common. One small child asked if dragons got lonely. Ember was quiet for a long moment before responding in a way that made Elena's expression soften. She translated, saying that dragons had been lonely for 5,000 years while waiting for their queen to call them back from exile. But now they were home again. Captain Hayes approached Elena as she watched the children play, finding a moment when she was standing slightly apart from the chaos. He said that she had changed everything and that ships were arriving daily with requests for asylum and protection, and that Meridian Point was becoming a symbol of something larger than just a trading station. Elena was quiet for a moment, watching Leo laugh as Ember gently nuzzled him with a snout that was larger than the boy's entire body. She said that changing everything had not been her intention when she first left her throne all those years ago. All she had wanted was to live a quiet life away from the responsibilities and expectations that came with being Etherian royalty. But seeing her son sitting alone and afraid had reminded her that true responsibility was not something that could be abandoned, just because it was difficult. Hayes nodded and said that the other Etherians who had been living in hiding like Elena had done were starting to emerge and reveal themselves, because her example had given them courage. Elena sighed, knowing that this meant the galaxy was going to have to adjust to the presence of a species that most beings had believed was extinct. She said that her husband Leo's father had been a human soldier who died defending a colony from raiders when their son was only 2 years old. Before he died, he made Elena promise that she would not hide what she was from their son, and that she would teach Leo about both sides of his heritage so that he could choose his own path. Hayes said that Leo's father sounded like a wise man. Elena smiled sadly and agreed, saying that her husband had seen her without her crown and without her power, and loved her anyway. He had taught her what humans called grace under pressure, which meant facing impossible odds and still choosing compassion over cruelty. She explained that this was why she had chosen to give her son a human name. In the old language, his full name was Leonidas Starborn Shadowmere, and he carried titles that meant prince and heir and a dozen other things that came with being born to the last royal bloodline. But they called him Leo because before he was a prince or an heir, he was a boy. A human boy who deserved to run and play and make mistakes and learn without the weight of an empire on his shoulders. Elena looked at Hayes directly and said that this was why she had chosen him to run the station. When Hayes looked at Leo, he had not seen a political opportunity or a valuable hostage. He had seen a child who needed protection. That kind of thinking was what the galaxy needed more than ancient technology or powerful weapons. As the sun of the nearby system set through the viewport, casting golden light across the observation deck, Elena called to Leo, saying it was time for dinner. Leo asked hopefully if Ember could come too. Elena laughed and said that Ember might be slightly too large for the station cafeteria, but they could eat in the hangar bay if Leo wanted as. They walked away hand in hand with Ember following behind and somehow fitting through corridors that should have been far too small. The other children waved goodbye. Already the galaxy was changing in ways both large and small. Stories were spreading across communication networks about the Etherian queen who gave up everything for love and then returned to power, not for conquest but for protection. Stories about a woman who showed that true strength came from choosing compassion, even when violence would be easier. And at the center of all these stories was a small human boy who had been mocked and dismissed and threatened, but who survived through simple faith that his mother would come back for him. Leo would grow up to bridge two worlds, carrying the ancient wisdom of the Etherians and the resilient, compassionate heart of humanity. Above Meridian Point, the Dragon Fleet kept watch, no longer serving as weapons of war, but as guardians of a new age where strength served wisdom and power, protected the vulnerable, an age where even the smallest voice could change the galaxy if people were willing to listen. Because Elena had learned the most important lesson that any being with power could learn. It was not about being the strongest or the most advanced or the most feared. It was about what you chose to do with what you had. Sometimes the greatest power in the universe was simply love that was fierce and uncompromising and willing to move stars and topple empires for those we hold dear. Leo would carry that lesson forward into a future that was bright, with possibility, a living symbol that humans and Etherians together could build something better than either species had achieved alone. The mocking had stopped, the cruelty had ended, the galaxy had learned, and Elena Shadowmere, who was both queen and mother, had shown them all that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not a weapon or an army or ancient technology. It was a parent fighting for their child. The stars shone brightly through the viewports of Meridian Point as the station hummed, with new life and new purpose, proving that even in the cold darkness of space, kindness could take root and grow into something beautiful.